right, so today we're going to start on classes and objects. As you may have heard, Java is a object-oriented programming language. And so what does that mean? Basically, everything in Java is an object, and an object is an idea. So if you think of students in a class, in many programming languages that are not object-oriented, you'd have individual variables about each student, about their, GPA, their maybe height, their address, their email, their ID, all this kind of stuff. But in object-oriented programming languages, what you do is you think of a student as an object, an idea, and you think about what are the properties that that student has, and what are the types of things that that student can do. So the things that an object can do are called methods, otherwise known as functions in other languages. And the descriptive variables of students, like their height and weight and GPA, are called properties. So those are the properties of the object. So I'm going to go ahead and make a class here. Is that the right way around for you guys?
Yeah.
Okay. So I have this class student, and let's just say we have GPA. We're going to save that as a double. And what else do we need? An ID, which we'll call, all your IDs are integers, so we're going to call it an integer ID. Okay, those are semicolons, not J's. I write them really weird, I'm sorry. And what can a student do? A student can I don't know. Let's say they can set their GPA. So I'm going to say set GPA. Oh, and I have to put I have to pass in some kind of variable. Don't worry too much about the syntax here. I'm just trying to get across the point that there are two parts to each class. There are the properties, and there are methods. Okay. But this is just kind of like an architectural diagram. This is not, a class is not something you can actually use, right? If you have an architectural diagram, you still need to build the house or the building or whatever it is that your architectural diagram is. So a class is just kind of this description of what a student is, but we don't actually have any students yet. We don't have any objects. And in order to create a student, we need to have something called a constructor. And the constructor, which builds an object from a class. So just like in the real world, a constructor goes and builds a building from an architectural diagram. The constructor in Java always has exactly the same name as the class, which kind of makes sense, right? If I have an architectural diagram of a house, then the object that I'm going to build is a house. So it has the same name. So inside this class here, I'm going to have a constructor called student. So here is my constructor and my class name are the same. I'm going to, again, not worry too much about syntax right now. But usually in your constructor, you'll do things like set the GPA, set the variables to some default. So your GPA is 0 and your ID is 0 as well, or something like that. So now I have a fully functioning class. This is a full-on class. And this works for anything, right? If you have cars, right, you're going to have a class car. Maybe you're going to have the model and the make and the year it was made and its mileage. Maybe those will be its properties. You might have a method called honk the horn or, I don't know, drive. And those would do different things. And then you would also have a constructor called car, the same as the class, so that you could actually create car objects and use them. So now that I've kind of defined what the architecture of my student looks like, how do I actually create one of these objects and use it? That's a great question. So here is my class. So up here, I'm just going to put my class student. And I'm just going to put dots here because it's the same thing as it was before. So this will be, this whole thing will also be in a file called student.java. So we don't have to worry about that right now because we're not actually building these in a programming environment. If we were in person, we would have like Dr. Java or something, or Replit or whatever. We'd be building these and you'd have to know all about the files and stuff. But luckily, we don't have to do that right now. Anyway, point being, we have this class. We know we have a constructor that helps us build them. So how do we use that to make an actual student? Well, in our main program, and again, don't worry too much about what these words mean right now, believe me. You will understand this in a couple of weeks. This is our main program. Main program always looks like this in Java. Don't worry about what the other words mean. We'll get there, I promise. But what we want to do right now is we want to create a student object. We know we have this class definition over here, but we want to actually make one and use it. So because we have this class definition, instead of just having integers and doubles and booleans and things like that, we have created a brand new variable type called student. So I can say student, what should I call my student? Bob. So that's just a variable name. That's exactly like saying int x. But if I have int x, I want to set it to 5 or something like that. I can't do that with Bob. I can't just say Bob equals 5. I have to use the constructor that I made in my class, this right here, to make a new student. I can't just use a number or something like that, because a student has all this information inside of it. And so I have to use these to interact with my student. So if I want to create a new student named Bob, I just say, I want a new student. And that's it. I have created an object called Bob, and it contains all of this information in it. When I called the constructor here to build my new student, Bob, it automatically set the GPA and the ID inside of it to 0. Right? It called this method right here. I said new student. So it called student. It set the GPA to 0 and the ID to 0. So Bob, inside Bob, now has a GPA of 0 and an ID of 0. But say when I create a student, I actually know their GPA and their ID. Right? For brand new students, when they enter kindergarten or something like that, yeah, maybe I set it all to 0. But like, what if somebody moves here from IOTA and they already have a GPA and an ID? There's no way for me to do that. Luckily, there is a way for me to do that. And that is called overloading the constructor. So in this version of the constructor right here, you'll notice that there are 2 parentheses here with nothing inside them. That means I'm not sending information to that constructor. But right below it, or actually anywhere in the class, but usually right below it, I could create a new constructor goes in there that accepts a double and an integer. So I don't delete this. I keep the original one there because I might need it for brand new students. But I'm overloading it. So this is overloading because I have exactly the same name. They're both called student, but one takes 0 parameters and this one takes 2 parameters. And so inside this one, I will set GPA equal to G and ID equal to I. So now I have two separate constructors depending on how I want to use it, how I want to use my object. So I'm going to make a new student called Alice. And when I build this new student object, instead of the default constructor that doesn't take any parameters at all, I'm going to use this new one that I created that takes a double and an integer. So the double is her GPA, which is 99.9, and her ID is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And both of these will work because Java knows to use the one with no parameters, right, over here, because we didn't send it anything. So it knows to automatically do this behind the scenes. And it knows that if I send it two parameters, hey, you can't use this one, use this one instead. So behind the scenes, it will automatically choose the right one. And the nice thing about that is you can have as many of these as you want. As long as the parameters are different, Java will automatically know which one to call. So you might have first name and last name, right? So you'll have another constructor with just the first name and last name. You might have another constructor with first name, last name, and GPA. Another constructor with first name, last name, GPA, and ID. You can have as many as you want as long as the parameters are different so that Java can figure out which one you mean automatically behind the scenes. If you just tried to make one with first name and one with last name, if they were both strings, then it wouldn't know which you're trying to use and it would be confused. So the parameters have to be different for Java to automatically figure out which one you're trying to use.